As is far too often the case, I woke up this morning and before too much of the morning had gotten away from me, I began scrolling through Twitter. I don't spend much, if any, time on Instagram or Facebook. I don't even have a TikTok or Snap account, but YouTube and Twitter, I will confess that I spend a bit too much time on both platforms. So as I was on Twitter this morning, several people that I follow had posted and were commenting on a portion of a video from the podcast Trigonometry with Sam Harris, the atheist. Now, in addition to spending a considerable amount of time on Twitter and YouTube, I have spent an overabundance of hours, a ridiculous amount probably, listening to atheists over the years, especially as a Christian pastor. It would seem kind of strange that I listen to so many different atheists, although I do think that pastors should be aware of what people are saying. So I love atheists, and Sam Harris is right near the top of my list of atheists, the ones that I listen to. I've been a subscriber to his podcast for years. I have his book here on my shelf, Letters to a Christian Nation, pretty interesting book. And I listen to a number of the things that he says. I think he's pretty rational and reasonable. He really thinks through things that he's talking about. So Sam Harris was being interviewed on the Trigonometry podcast, and he said some things that really wound people up as it relates to the 2016 and 2020 elections. It is no secret for those that follow Sam or those in his orbit that Sam really, and I mean really, does not like Donald Trump. And this clip from the interview reveals the extent to which Sam does not like Trump and did not want him to win in 2020.
Listen, I don't care what's in Hunter Biden's. I mean, Hunter Biden, at that point, Hunter Biden literally could have had the corpses of children in his basement. I would not have cared, right? It's like, there's nothing. First of all, it's Hunter Biden, right? It's not Joe Biden, but even if whatever scope of Joe Biden's corruption is, like if we could just go down that rabbit hole endlessly and understand that he's getting kickbacks from Hunter Biden's deals in Ukraine or wherever else, right? Or China, it is infinitesimal compared to the corruption we know Trump is involved in. It's like a firefly to the sun, right? I mean, like there's just, it doesn't even stack up against Trump University, right? Trump University as a story is worse than anything that could be in Hunter Biden's laptop, in my view, right? Now that doesn't answer the people who say it's still completely unfair to not have looked at the laptop in a timely way and to have shut down the New York Post's Twitter account. Like that's just a conspiracy. That's a left-wing conspiracy to deny the presidency to Donald Trump. Absolutely, it was. Absolutely, right? But I think it was warranted, right? And again, it's a coin toss as to whether or not
Sam, I'm sorry.
That particular piece.
I'm really sorry. I was the one that said we should move on, but you've just said something I really struggle with there, which is
the kids in the basement.
The kids in the basement. I'm interested in democracy. You're saying you are content with a left-wing conspiracy to prevent somebody being democratically re-elected as president.
Now, the social media chatter on this clip is huge. In fact, Sam Harris is trending #1 on Twitter as I record this. I understand all of the things that are being said about this clip, and even out of context from the rest of the nearly 2-hour interview, it isn't tempered by what Sam said before or after this clip that I just showed. In other words, this is not an out of context or malevolent cut or edit. This is just as bad as it seems from Harris. But there is something that Sam says later in the interview, and I watched the entire interview. You can find it in the link in the description below. But there is something that Sam says later when he is talking about the woke chaos that has kind of gripped our society and some of the things that happened in the wake of the death of George Floyd in 2020, which I think reveal why Sam thinks the way that he does about Trump. Here's what he said later in the interview.
Like, you ask people to estimate how many black people do you think get murdered by white racist cops in America every year? They imagine we're talking thousands, right? So if you believe that, right, then what would you do? Mm-hmm. What would you? Wouldn't you too take to the streets when everyone says we're going to we're protesting on Tuesday? Of course, right? So it's like, you don't have to add too many pieces of distorting pseudo facts to get people who I otherwise totally understand to mouth all the predictable pieties on this topic. But the truth is, all of that is wrong, right? Like, you can count on two hands the number of unarmed black men who get killed every year by cops.
Now, again, I show this because I think this is where Sam really fails to see, or at least acknowledge, the potential flaw in his view about Trump. And it is the same flaw that I've seen when talking with others who hate Trump. And you could actually disconnect the entire discussion from Trump. You could say those who hate or absolutely hated Obama in the past, or those who now really dislike Biden at this point in time. It has been shown several times that the hyper-hysteric response to things that are terrible, like the death of George Floyd, often that hyper-hysteric response is because it is a response based upon the wrong interpretations or understandings of the situations or the context in which that event takes place. What do I mean by that? Well, if you are convinced, as Sam said in that video that I just showed, if you are convinced that thousands of black men die each year at the hands of white police officers, and one day you see the horrible video of George Floyd's death, then it would appear to be the most hideous and horrendous example of a racist lynching. It would confirm your worst fears, and you would probably rightly rise up and protest in horrible disgust and anger. But if it is true, as the facts seem to indicate, that the number of unarmed black men who die each year at the hands of white police officers is much, much smaller than you believed. That is, there are typically less than 50, not thousands, who die in that way. And I'm not saying that 50 is okay. I don't know the circumstances of any of those, nor do I think that Sam Harris, as he says in the interview, that we fully understand everything about George Floyd's death. That's not the point of what I'm saying. What I'm focused on here is that if you were convinced that thousands of black men die each year at the hands of white police officers, and you saw the video of Floyd's death, you would rightly protest. I agree with that. That's what Sam says. So what does that have to do with what Sam said earlier in the interview about Trump, which appears to many people to be insane or at least unreasonable from a guy who is typically hyper rational? Well, if you believed, like a number of people do, that Donald J. Trump is Hitler reincarnate, and if you were convinced that Trump is a bigoted white supremacist racist, and that his presidency would lead to countless deaths and a potential nuclear disaster, then there is probably nothing that would be off the table as it relates to tactics to keep him out of office or to remove him from office. And like I said, you can remove Trump from the equation. If you were convinced that the person running from office or in office were the same or on the same level as Hitler or quite literally the Antichrist, then what wouldn't you do to stop that person? Sam basically reveals that at the end of the day, if it is basically win or lose, his ethical framework is emotivist and situational. In other words, he does not hold to a strong virtue ethic like he oftentimes espouses. He's like most irrational people, governed by their emotions and swayed by popular opinion.